Victor Sloane walked into the Moretti boardroom on a Thursday night, believing he held the winning hand. He walked out 2 hours later, without a business, without allies, and without a single dollar he could legally claim as his own. He never fully understood what dismantled him. That part, the mechanism, the precision of it, started with a woman he had spent months treating like wallpaper. Her name was Rosa Delgado. She had worked as Dante Moretti's executive secretary for exactly 26 months. She was the first person in the office every morning, the last to leave most nights, and the only person in the entire Moretti operation who had ever made Dante's calendar run without a single collision. She was full-figured, her presence substantial and grounded in a way that matched everything else about her. The unhurried quality of her voice, the weight of her attention when she fixed it on something, the particular stillness she carried into rooms where everyone else was performing. She held a master's degree in forensic accounting from Northwestern that she had never once mentioned in 26 months of employment. Nobody had thought to ask. Dante Moretti had not ignored Rosa in the way people ignore things they find unimportant. He had ignored her the way a man ignores a fire he has decided not to touch, with deliberate, practiced distance. He noticed everything about her. He noticed the exact moment each morning when she set his coffee on the corner of his desk without looking at him. He noticed that she kept a small photograph tucked inside her left desk drawer that she never displayed. He noticed that when his lieutenants spoke over her in meetings, she did not argue. She simply waited, and then, without raising her voice, said the thing that ended the argument. He noticed all of it, and for 26 months he had said nothing, because Dante Moretti was a man who had survived by understanding which fires you do not approach. The silence between them was not nothing. It was a structure, elaborate, load-bearing, and increasingly fragile. Victor Sloane had been Dante's second lieutenant for 4 years before he left to build his own operation on the South Side. The departure had been framed as an expansion, a satellite network, a mutual arrangement. What it actually was, and everyone in the room had understood this except Victor, was Dante letting him leave because keeping him had become more expensive than the alternative. Victor had the instincts of a predator and the ego of a man who had never once been told the truth about his limitations. For 4 years he had watched Dante's operation run with a precision he couldn't replicate, and he had concluded, in the way that certain men always conclude, that the precision was luck, that the success was geography, that if he had Dante's territory, he would do better. What he had actually been watching, without knowing it, was Rosa Delgado. The quarterly review in February was the moment the silence cracked. Not all the way, just enough to let something dangerous in. Victor had appeared uninvited, which was itself a statement, arriving with 2 of his men and settling into the conference room with the practiced ease of someone auditioning for a chair that didn't belong to him. Dante had said nothing. He rarely needed to say things directly. He simply looked at Victor across the table, with the flat, patient attention of a man who has decided the outcome already and is simply waiting for the sequence to complete. Rosa had been presenting the quarterly financials, third-quarter numbers, distribution margins, the legal holdings that laundered the rest of it, clean, documented, formatted in the way she always formatted things, which was to say, without a single number that couldn't be defended in front of a federal judge. She was mid-sentence when Victor interrupted. He said, "No offense, but why is your secretary running this meeting?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that has texture. He continued, with the particular confidence of a man who has mistaken cruelty for charisma. "I'm not saying she doesn't make great coffee. I'm just saying this is a serious room." He let his gaze move across her in the specific, deliberate way that was designed to make a woman feel simultaneously seen and erased. "Maybe send her to get us something to eat. Let the adults talk." 3 of the lieutenants present looked immediately at the table. One of them laughed, a short, nervous sound, the kind that has nothing to do with finding something funny and everything to do with social survival. The room had turned into the kind of place where everyone was acutely aware of their own breathing. Rosa did not flinch. She set down the folder she was holding, smoothed the page in front of her with one hand, and looked at Victor Sloane with the precise expression of a woman who has already decided that this moment does not get to define her. She said quietly, "I'll finish the presentation." And she did. Every number, every footnote, every projected margin for the following quarter, delivered without a tremor in her voice and without once looking at Victor again. Dante said nothing, but he watched, and the distance he had maintained for 26 months shifted, not collapsed, not yet, but moved, the way tectonic plates move before anyone on the surface understands what is coming. Dr. Linda Hartling's research on humiliation at Wellesley College distinguishes between shame, which is private, and humiliation, which requires an audience. What Hartling found is that public humiliation, unlike private criticism, doesn't simply wound. It is designed to redefine. The target is meant to absorb the crowd's reaction as confirmation. Rosa Delgado had refused the redefinition, and that refusal, visible to everyone in the room, had done something to the air that nobody there could have articulated, but everyone had felt. Nobody understood yet what they had just witnessed, but they would. What happened over the following 6 weeks was this. Victor Sloane, operating on the assumption that Rosa was a soft point in Dante's architecture, began using her as a pressure lever. He made inquiries, through intermediaries, through people who owed him, about her daily schedule, her routines, the details of what she handled. He approached 2 of the Moretti lieutenants, separately, with offers that amounted to trading information about internal operations in exchange for a share of Victor's Southside margins. He was not subtle about this. He was the kind of man who believed that boldness was indistinguishable from intelligence. What he did not know was that Rosa Delgado had spent her career in forensic accounting learning precisely one thing above all others: how money moves when someone is trying to hide where it's going. And for 3 weeks before Victor made his approach to the first lieutenant, Rosa had already identified the pattern in the cash flows. Not because she had been surveilling Victor, because she had noticed a discrepancy in the distribution accounts, a small, elegant discrepancy, the kind that only looks accidental to someone who doesn't understand what they're actually looking at. And she had followed it, quietly, after hours, the way she did everything, without announcing it, without asking for credit, without waiting for permission. She had built a complete financial map of Victor Sloane's operation. Every shell company, every intermediary account, every transaction that connected his Southside network back to the 2 lieutenants he was trying to turn. She had documentation that would be coherent to a federal prosecutor, devastating to a rival organization, and irreversible in its consequences. She kept it in a folder in her left desk drawer, next to the small photograph nobody had ever asked her about. She had not yet decided what to do with it. The decision was made for her on a Wednesday evening when Victor's man followed her to her parking garage and made it very clear, without touching her, that her continued health was contingent on her continued silence about things she might or might not have noticed. He was professional about it. That almost made it worse. Rosa drove home. She sat at her kitchen table for 40 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called Dante Moretti's direct line, a number she had dialed perhaps 4 times in 26 months, always for professional reasons, always briefly. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I need 30 minutes, not tomorrow, tonight." There was a pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds. He said, "My office, 1 hour." This is what John Gottman, after 4 decades of studying human connection, described as the moment of turning toward. The choice, made under pressure, to reach toward rather than away. Rosa had every reason to handle this alone, to protect herself quietly, to use the information she'd built in a way that required nothing from Dante Moretti personally. She chose differently, and that choice, which looked like vulnerability, was in fact the most precise move she made. She arrived with the folder. She sat across from him, not in the chair positioned for guests, but in the chair beside his desk, the one his lieutenants never used. And she opened the folder and walked him through it. 20 minutes. Every shell company, every lateral transfer, every timestamp. She did not editorialize. She did not explain that she was angry about the parking garage, or afraid, or that she had been building this for 3 weeks. She presented the information the way she always presented information, which was to say as clearly as possible and without performing anything. Dante Moretti was silent for the last 4 minutes. He was looking at the documents, but he was also, Rosa noticed, very carefully not looking at her. In the particular way of a man who is managing something he was not prepared to manage. He said, "How long did this take you?" She said, 3 weeks. The framework was 2 nights. The verification took longer. He looked at her then, not the way he had always looked at her, which was attentively, carefully, from a distance. He looked at her the way a man looks when a structure he has lived inside without understanding is suddenly made visible. He said, "Why didn't you bring this to me earlier?" She said, "I needed to be certain. I don't bring you uncertainty." 26 months of things unsaid moved through that room without either of them acknowledging it directly. The file between them on the desk was real. The financial map was real. And so was the 4 inches of space between their chairs that neither of them moved to close. He said, "Thursday, the quarterly review." He paused. "I want you in the room." She said, "I'm always in the room." He said, "This time, differently." The Thursday meeting was the last time Victor Sloane appeared in any room connected to the Moretti operation. He arrived again with 2 men, with the practiced ease of a man who had convinced himself that boldness was a form of armor. He found Rosa already seated, not in the corner with the folders, but at the main table, to Dante's left. He found every lieutenant present. He found, to his visible confusion, 2 men he didn't recognize who were positioned near the door. Rosa opened the folder. She said, "Before we begin, there are some financial discrepancies in the Southside accounts that we should address." Victor started to speak. She continued, which was not something he had expected from a woman he had publicly reduced to a coffee order 6 weeks earlier. She named the shell companies. She named the transfer dates. She named, specifically and without hesitation, the 2 lieutenants who had been approached. She placed printed copies in front of each person at the table. The silence in the room had a different quality than any previous silence. Not the loaded, performative silence of a meeting where everyone is watching the power dynamic, but the very specific silence of men understanding that someone has already won an argument that they didn't know was happening. Victor Sloane's face moved through denial, then comprehension, then something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man who has finally identified a thing he underestimated, too late to do anything about the identification. He said, "This is..." Dante said, "You're done." Not loudly. There was no theater in it. It was simply a fact being stated in the same register as all other facts. The 2 men near the door had already moved. The 2 lieutenants who had been approached sat very still, with the expressions of men who have decided that the best available option is to be useful. Victor Sloane's operation was unwound over the following 11 days. The financial documentation Rosa had built was airtight in the way that only something built by someone who genuinely understands the material can be airtight. The Southside network dissolved. The intermediary accounts were frozen. The shell companies that had taken years to construct were rendered irrelevant in the way that precise information always renders complexity irrelevant. Not by force, but by exposure. The two lieutenants who had been approached were reassigned, not removed. Reassigned, which was, in the Moretti operation, understood as a message about the cost of disloyalty that was more effective than any harsher consequence would have been. This is what Robert Cialdini, in his foundational work on influence, identified as the difference between compliance and commitment. Punishment produces compliance, but visible consequence produces genuine recalibration. The remaining lieutenants had watched Rosa Delgado work. They understood now what the woman with the folders actually was. On the Friday after the Thursday meeting, Dante arrived at the office 30 minutes before anyone else. This was unusual. Rosa was already there, as she always was, with his coffee on the corner of his desk. He stood in the doorway of her office for a moment before she acknowledged him. He said, "The Northwestern degree." She looked up. He said, "I had your employment file pulled. Why didn't you list it?" She said, "You didn't ask about it." He said, "I'm asking now." She held his gaze for a moment, then she said, "Forensic accounting. I specialized in financial fraud investigation. I worked 2 years at the SEC before..." She paused. Before a different kind of opportunity presented itself. The distance that had existed between them for 26 months, maintained with such discipline, such deliberate precision by both of them, had already collapsed on Thursday night in the office with the folder on the desk. What remained was just the acknowledgement of it, which is always the harder part. The psychoanalyst Esther Perel, writing about desire and long-term relationships, argues that what sustains attraction is not familiarity, but the tension between knowing and not knowing. The sense that the other person contains something still unresolved. Dante Moretti had spent 26 months living inside that tension, without understanding that it was the specific Rosa Delgado he was in tension with. The Thursday meeting had not created something new. It had named something that had been architectural. He said, "I want you at the table from now on, not beside it." She said, "That's a different conversation than the one we're currently having." He said, "I know." She said, "Then have that one first." He crossed the 4 feet of distance between the door and her desk. He set his hands flat on the surface, the way he set his hands on a table when he was about to say something he had decided to commit to entirely. He looked at her with the particular attention she had watched him give to every situation he took seriously, and said, "26 months ago, I made a decision that the distance was necessary. I was wrong. I want to correct it. I'm asking if you're willing to let me." Rosa Delgado had spent 26 months being precisely who she was: competent, controlled, careful with what she showed and to whom. She had walked through a parking garage threat and sat down at a folder and called a number and built a case and dismantled a man's entire operation from a desk in the corner where he kept her. She had done all of it without asking for recognition, without performing capability, without waiting for permission. She looked at Dante for a long moment. Then she said, "The coffee I've been bringing you for 2 years. You take it with a half measure of sugar. You've never asked for less. I've never offered more. Start there." He understood exactly what she meant. Some silences, when they finally break, don't make noise. They simply become something else, a different kind of structure, one that both people inside it built together. What had taken 26 months to accumulate took considerably less time to resolve, once both parties had stopped pretending the tension wasn't foundational. Victor Sloane, for his part, was last seen attempting to reconstruct a much smaller operation in Cleveland. He had not recovered his South Side network. He had not recovered his reputation in any room that mattered. What he had recovered, eventually, was the particular clarity that comes from having been dismantled by someone he had publicly dismissed as irrelevant. Whether that clarity was useful to him or simply painful is a question his psychology would determine. Either way, it was not Dante's concern. And it was certainly not Rosa's. The Moretti operation continued, quietly, precisely, with no unnecessary waste in the accounts. The woman who had run it from the corner of a room for 2 years now sat at the table. The conversation that changed everything was not the one in the boardroom with the folder, though that one mattered. It was the one on a Friday morning over coffee in a small office that smelled like good paper and early light, where two people who had been circling the same silence for 26 months finally decided to say the thing out loud. There is something worth sitting with in that. Not the danger, not the dismantling, but the ordinary courage of the conversation that comes after, the one where nothing is at stake except what you actually want. If that landed the way it should, a like takes 2 seconds and costs nothing. Subscribe if you want the next story. Some silences are even longer, and some breaks are even louder.